Hey guys.
Hello, hello.
So welcome to the show, guys. We've got Justin and Satish with us. It's good to have you on the show. You're both from the VPC Lattice team, correct?
Right, we covered kind of all things application layer networking. So
Okay. So what I know about VPC Lattice, like it's an application networking service, correct?
that is correct.
Okay.
Yeah, I
So
think
I'll
good
start
good
with.
classification. You're an expert.
All right, great. Well, I'm going to start with the softball question, right? So I know what an application is, and I know what networking is. And Amazon has a lot of great networking services. We have Route 53, CloudFront, Direct Connect, lots of great stuff. But this is something completely different. So why don't you tell me a little bit about what application networking is all about?
It's a good question. Yeah, good place to start off too, because I think um, there's a lot of people that are in that same kind of boat, right? They've heard networking, they've heard application, but when you bridge the two together, they're like, "What is this thing? Like, why do I need to care?" Um, and so I think if you think about kind of where applications have gone over the last couple of years, they're no longer one big thing, right? We used to talk about monoliths, and of course they're still there,
Yeah.
but even those monoliths are typically hooked up to the internet or hooked up to something where they have other dependencies, other things they need to talk about, right? On the far end of the extreme, it's kind of microservices, where that one big application is now a bunch of smaller services, right? And so when you do that, and you split up your application, you make them into a bunch of different services, it's not internal calls anymore. Now you need to have networking to connect these things together. And so when most people think about networking in that space, they think about like the actual like IP connectivity, right? This application or this service gets an IP address. That other one over there gets some sort of IP address. Maybe there's some sort of router, whether it's living on-prem or a virtual one in the cloud.
Yeah.
I need to put a router here to kind of connect things together. That's traditional networking. But that's just the start of it, right? Like that's the plumbing. And there's a whole different layer on top of that for making this stuff kind of connect to each other. So you mentioned Route 53. This is basically service discovery, right? It's one of the first things the application needs to do, right? The application needs to say, hey, how do I find X, Y, and Z, my service dependency? And then Route 53 or some sort of service discovery mechanism would reply back and say, oh, that's an IP address, blah, 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 right? And then the application goes through a whole bunch of different kind of tasks in order to actually get that traffic over there, right? And see, these are things like service discovery, like we just talked about. Could be things like load balancing. If you've got kind of an auto scaling group of your service, it could be things like authentication and authorization, which is really, really important nowadays in kind of zero trust community. But if you see here, I'm just kind of like layering things on top of it, right?
Yeah.
And so what application networking is if you think about bridging those two together and saying, look, modern applications can't get away with just the application part. It's not a monolith. They also can't get away with just networking. You need all of these things put together. Sounds kind of crazy, and it kind of is. And so that's the space we work in. And that's what VPC Lattice is really kind of trying to target is how do we make this simpler? How do we provide a managed service for all of those things, the application portion and the networking portion?
Very cool.
Satish,
Nice.
you and I talk about this all the time. Did I forget anything here?
No, that's the part. It's like, today application identity is still tied at layer 3, right? So Lattice sort of tries to decouple that and simplify how you do the service discovery, how do you connect all your microservices, and lots of those pieces come together in application networking.
So you talked a little bit about why you built it, right? But who did you build it for?
That's a good question. So another thing on here. So we've talked about kind of the application portion. We talked about the network portion. The same way that technologies kind of have silos like that, engineers and kind of implementers and companies have silos like that too. It's just they're not called silos a lot of the time, even though they are. They're typically called personas, right? And so you have some sort of persona that is maybe an admin type or puts the admin hat on. It could be a network admin. It could be a cluster admin if we're talking about ECS or Kubernetes. It could be a cloud admin that's kind of controlling the whole cloud environment. It can also be a security admin, some sort of infosec person that's really kind of in control of doing all the kind of making sure that you don't end up on Hacker News type stuff. So that's one persona, right? I kind of put that in the admin bucket.
Yeah.
And that's the network portion. I kind of put that there. On the application side, it's typically a developer, right? And it doesn't have to necessarily be the person typing the actual code. A lot of the time it is. But it's basically somebody that owns the service, right? They don't own the infrastructure per se. They own the service that we were talking about. And I think when you look at how these layers have kind of separated over time to fit into these different personas, they did it out of necessity, right? Network layer, application layer. But what happened is it ends up creating this kind of very disjointed interfaces, right? Because the admins are looking at their set of tools, the developers are looking at their set of tools, and this could be metrics and logs and things like that. But at 2 a.m., when there's a big outage, kind of both teams are crossing their fingers and just kind of hoping like, hey, did the timestamps match up? Are we looking at the same stuff? And it's just created this very, very disjointed world. And so this was first and foremost in kind of our mental model when we created VPC Lattice, was how do we bridge this gap between the admins and the developers? How do we create a managed platform that gave kind of the tools and controls to lock things down for the admins so that they can audit and enforce their security practices, but then also give the developers kind of a simpler experience, right? We don't want, I love the term full stack engineer, but it's getting really difficult, right? Like it's really difficult for an engineer to be really proficient at that full stack. And so we're trying to simplify it and say like, hey, you don't need to be a network expert, right? You don't need to do that. And so give them a simple user experience that they're very familiar with native integration across compute platforms. Like if they're using Lambda, stay with Lambda. If you're using Kubernetes, stay with Kubernetes. If you're with ECS, stay with ECS. So that kind of a thing, right? Just giving admins and developers kind of tools that make sense to them, meeting them where they're at.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I love the way you started to explain it where, you know, when we think of traditional networking, we may be down at like the physical layer network, maybe the presentation layer. Lattice is really coming in at the application layer. So tell me about some of the key features of Lattice, like what makes it unique?
For sure. Yeah, so I think we touched on a couple of them when we just talked about kind of application and networking. But first and foremost, there's a handful of things that basically everybody needs to do, right? And this is almost everybody in the cloud, even if they have monolith applications. You need to have service discovery. You need to be able to actually discover your services. You need to have network connectivity, right, between VPCs and accounts, because a lot of the time, these services are deployed across multiple VPCs and multiple accounts. And this is great because it provides kind of like reduction of blast radius or a scope of impact reduction. You can basically give your developers a little sandbox, AKA your account is your permission boundary, and give them a sandbox from a network perspective, VPC, right? Your network boundary. And so you need to have that service discovery. That's one of the features automatically built into VPC Lattice. Automatic connectivity between VPCs and accounts. So if you go ahead and you look up a service, the dependency you have, I don't care if it's in a different VPC, different account, VPC Lattice will automatically figure out how to route that traffic, get that traffic to its destination without you having to configure routing table rules and network connectivity and all that kind of stuff. It also is a full-blown application layer proxy. So if you're familiar with something like an application load balancer, the thing that says, hey, if my API request comes in and it has a path that says API 1, I want you to send it to this set of services. And if you have another one that has a header field that says user agent equals Justin, I want you to send that to Lambda or something like that. And so it's a full-blown proxy. It gives you kind of these controls that you can shift traffic around how you see fit, which is another really kind of critical thing in modern applications. On top of that, and this is a very popular topic right now, you probably heard the very buzzwordy term of zero trust, but it really comes down to just kind of authentication and authorization, right? How do we provide application level authentication to actually prove, hey, I'm not an IP address. I'm a real identity when I make a request. And then what do you do with that authentication? What do you do with that identity? That's where context-specific authorization comes into play. And so VPC Lattice kind of blends a lot of these features we just talked about all into one service that kind of handles this for you. So you don't really need to think about it. Might sound like a lot, but that's the whole purpose, right? We're removing that complexity and putting it into a managed service.
Yeah, so it sounds like this is super useful for developers without having to become infrastructure network engineers as well, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And Satish, did I while I was rambling there, did I forget about anything?
Not at all. Yeah. So, the other thing you should look about VPC Lattice is about developers typically prefer their own compute type. Doesn't need to be containers all the time, and they might choose their preferred container orchestration. They might choose serverless as well, right? So Lattice sort of doesn't differentiate between those. You are now free to choose the most optimal compute type for your application, and that's what we built Lattice for.
Excellent. So you mentioned a little bit about zero trust. How would Lattice fit into a customer's zero trust strategy?
Perfect. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really popular topic, and I'm glad we're touching on it because a lot of people see it all over the news, and probably their CEOs and CIOs and CISOs and CSOs are all saying, "Hey, you got to do this," right? Like, "Hey, we should be zero trust tomorrow." And a lot of folks kind of get a little bit of anxiety, going, "Oh my gosh, how do I do this? Like, I'm just now I'm learning how to put security groups to lock down my infrastructure." So companies are kind of all over the place, right, with where they are today. And I think they've gotten this kind of motion of, hey, we need to get better, which is cool, right? Like, it's awesome. And this is the right pattern that we should be going into. But I think it's also kind of a lot of buzzwords, a lot of hype for something that's been around for a very long time. And that really is this idea of really getting to reliable authentication, right? Who are you, right? Are you a healthy thing, and what are you? So reliable authentication, and then context-specific authorization, right? So not just saying things like, hey, I want to put this perimeter around things, and anything in this perimeter can talk to each other, but get into the details of like, hey, no, only these certain identities, right? After you've already got that reliable authentication, only these certain identities can do these things. And emphasis on these things, right? Like, what can they do? Do they get access to your whole application, or do they get a piece of it, right? And so this idea of reliable and strong authentication and context-specific authorization. The third pillar that people usually talk about is an idea of de-emphasis of network controls. And I love and I hate this one because it's important. You shouldn't be relying on IP addresses for your identity framework. Like, that is critical. We don't want to do that.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean like give up your network. Just open it up to the world, right? I like the idea of Swiss cheese, right? Like, it's a whole Swiss cheese. And if you get through the first hole, well, at least there's something else protecting you there. And so this idea of defense in depth and being able to kind of apply security controls at different layers is a much better position to be in. And so to tie this back to VPC Lattice, this was kind of first and foremost in our head. How do we give customers a way of locking down their VPCs, which, as you know, today is kind of like a network boundary. It's like a virtual data center in the cloud. If you don't put any doors or holes into it, it's completely isolated. Nobody can get in, nobody can get out. Yeah. That's also kind of useless, right? Like, if you have this little thing here that nothing can talk to, how do you deal with that? And so VPC Lattice allows you to kind of more intelligently and more automatically share the specific things that you want to share with that network, and then enforce that strong authentication, reliable authentication, and context-specific authorization. So on the technical front, I won't go too deep into it unless folks want me to, but we've integrated with AWS IAM, and a lot of folks are familiar with this. This is basically the same authentication engine that's handling Prime Day and almost 1 billion requests per second. So this is a globally scalable infrastructure, and it's been very robust. It's been around at Amazon for years, and you use it every day when you're in Amazon. This is the same authentication and authorization engine that we've built into VPC Lattice natively. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel. You get this out of the box with VPC Lattice. And so this is kind of playing on that zero trust story. You got network controls as well as application layer controls.
Yeah, no, I think that's super cool because, you know, back in the day, our control was really around access control lists. And not saying that we
100%.
should get away from that, right? There's still a place for that. But I love the way you describe the security in layers and security in depth. You don't just need to rely on one layer of security because, you know, a persistent hacker will eventually get around that if they're persistent enough.
Just think about this too. Like, how many times, don't tell my boss this, but like, I think about how many times I've gotten things wrong, right? And like, no matter how many times I look at a policy or I look at something, yeah, I get it wrong, right?
Yeah.
And the bigger that policy gets, the chances of you getting it wrong get bigger. And so, if you can reduce this and kind of have those kind of checks and balances in place, you're just in a better spot, you know?
Yeah. So, Satish, what's top of mind for you? Did we miss anything in Zero Trust?
Oh, yeah. I think we've covered a lot of that. So I think the idea of decoupling the application identity away from layer 3, layer 4, that frees up us to do a lot of different things, right? Like Justin mentioned, the IAM-based authentication at every request level. Before, you had to open up a security group or a NACL, and then all the flows were allowed through, or you chose them, specific flows. But with this level of authentication authorization at IAM, each service getting its own role. So that really scales really well, right, from a zero trust perspective. And we're also doing this at the request level itself. So now you don't have to worry about, hey, is this happening all the time? And then you get detailed logs for every request as well for your auditing, et cetera. So we tried to do a more complete story around not just addressing the network flow, but also the auditing, the post-processing after as well.
So since we're talking about access, I'm going to take a pause and make sure everybody knows about a survey. Hopefully the link's going to jump up at the bottom here in a second. But if you can take just a few minutes to fill out the survey for us, we'd love to give you access to what you want to hear from AWS on air so we can bring you the program you want. Really appreciate that. So Satish, I want to get back to that as well. Like Justin started hinting on it, but I want to get an idea of how customers should think about Lattice compared to App Mesh or Elastic Load Balancer, like and contextualize this around some of the other services we're offering.
Sure. Yeah. So Lattice often gets compared to service meshes, but we are more than a service mesh in that. In a lot of different ways, right? First of all, we support serverless Lambda. So that's one significant difference. And second, the service meshes, including our own app mesh and the others, are all still identifying applications at layer 3 and rely on other MTLS-like authentication authorization techniques that customers find it sometimes hard to manage and deploy. So that's another significant difference of moving the application identity away into IAM and having a super easily scalable way. And the third and the last difference I'll mention, these are the top 3 differences. There are a lot more. And the third difference is around scale. Like as your number of services grow, as your number of microservices grow, there's a pressure on your data plane and control plane to manage all these, right? Not just the traffic itself, stitching the security groups and NACLs together, having layer 3 access control, et cetera. And on the control plane, how do you add a new service? How do you decommission an existing service and all the relative microservices and reconfigure the network paths? So all those add a lot of complexity to both the cloud admin and also the developer too. So those are the 3 ways in which Lattice is sort of different and simplifies for both the personas.
Cool. So tell us a little bit about how customers can integrate partner solutions into Lattice.
There's a couple of different places that make the most sense. I think one of the things that we've really kind of tried to keep as kind of a tenet for ours is building natively into VPC so that you don't necessarily have to get into the different compute platforms. And as part of that, VPC Lattice kind of automatically handles a lot of the kind of stuff we've already talked about. One of the things that we are not solving to start is kind of ingress from the outside world. And so if you think about VPC Lattice, we talked a lot about it being a proxy and it being a network connectivity thing that just happens automatically behind the scenes. This is mostly for east-west communication, right? Like if you've got a service in one VPC, it could be the same VPC. It doesn't have to be across VPCs and accounts, but that connectivity, right? I've got a dependency call here. Okay, now I want to call back to that one. All of that kind of magic just kind of works. The connectivity just works. But what if you want to expose this to the outside world? Right? What if you want to get your service in some VPC to be accessible from some client on the internet there? And so I think we've been working with several partners that you'll probably see over the next couple of months, starting to release some information on there about how you can leverage ingress gateways as a solution to kind of come in and expose your services through VPC Lattice. And so it gives you kind of a really kind of cool centralized control mechanism for all ingress and egress technologies, which is kind of really powerful, right? Because a lot of the time you do want to give your service owners kind of a sandbox, which is a VPC, but you kind of want to like double check them. It's not that you don't trust them, but you kind of don't. And so you want to inspect the traffic as it comes in and comes out in a centralized fashion, instead of having to have firewalls and DPI, deep packet inspection, sorry for all the acronyms, in every single VPC. And so this kind of allows you to have that centralized control. There's some really good design patterns that allow you to do that kind of stuff. So hopefully we'll have some blogs and some partner information coming out very, very soon that we'll be excited to share once it's available.
Nice.
Awesome.
So we did just have a question from someone here in the chat. You mentioned ingress gateways, but Network Ninja says, I currently use transit gateways. Can I use Lattice with only 1 to 2 apps as a pilot and keep my beloved transit gateway in place?
Really cool. And I like the Network Ninja. So I'm a network and security person, my background. So I always am a fan of the network stuff. You can use transit gateway. So transit gateway is just operating at a different level. If you think about Lattice, it's a HTTP, HTTPS, gRPC level proxy. And so it kind of just automatically handles all that kind of L7 type traffic. If you have TCP workloads, UDP workloads, you're doing any kind of IP or super bandwidth heavy type stuff that you just want to have direct communication for, transit gateway, private link, VPC peering, they're still going to work just as is. It's just normal. This just kind of gives you a very simple way of just getting your application level traffic in a very, very simple way. But they work together. Yeah, so you're going to keep on loving using that thing that you're using.
Well, I do have some good news. Mikhail has said that they've been eager to get their hands on it. Super happy that it went GA so fast, as well as the application load balancer integration. So
nice.
Yeah, that's some quick feedback for you right there.
Yeah, I had a chance to actually meet him at reInvent last year, which is really fun. It's cool when you get to see whether you share things on LinkedIn or you see comments on blogs, and then you get to meet people in person. It was really cool to meet a couple of folks that have been following us for quite a long time, because we've been working on this for a while now. And so to have that kind of meeting in person was really, really nice.
All right, so I got to take a second to stick up for our partners. We love our partners. We work with them and our customers a lot. They bring a lot to the table. So how and can customers integrate any partner solutions with Lattice?
Yeah, I think if there's any partners out there that are looking for kind of integration, we'd love to talk to them. We love our partners. And I think there's a huge opportunity for that gateway solution. If you are an ingress gateway or API type style gateway, there's a great fit right there. We also talked about service mesh quite a bit. And I think that I don't want to discount service mesh. Service mesh has been something that's grown through the industry and evolved over the last several years. And they've solved a lot of really hard problems. And I think that there's a really good story, and we're talking to quite a few service mesh providers to do potential integrations, right? So if you think about it, we designed VPC Lattice to be a full-blown easy button for customers. And it solves probably the 90% of your workloads. For that 10%, or for that 10% of customers or whatever that have very, very advanced designs and want to have additional features, there's an opportunity to kind of use both of these together. And so I think over the next little bit here, since we're just getting GA today, you're going to start to see some partner integrations roll out in that space as well.
Excellent. Well, Satish, I got to tell you, I'm a visual learner. So I'm curious if you have, I know we don't have a demo ready for today, but I was curious if you had any visuals we may be able to share out. So I can get my head wrapped around this a little more.
Yeah, let me just pull up the slides here to show you. Think of how packet flows work, right? So here's one slide, and we can speak to this in more detail. So yeah, think of the, I'm in US East 1, I'm on VPC A production environment with a subnet and a security group, an instance running an application. And I'm going to using a Lattice service network that connects across my VPC A on the left to VPC B on the right. And here, you could have overlapping IP addresses across your subnets because Lattice is routing at layer 7. And then the routing configurations are, you can specify header, host, path, method-based routing, the authentication that we just discussed about IAM roles. So each instance on the left, and then the services that it needs to talk to in the other VPC on the right, services B, C, and D. And they could be running in EKS clusters, Lambda functions, EC2 autoscaling groups, and Lattice, the service network in between is connecting them all together. So you're not configuring route tables between service A and service B and service C and D. You're just connecting them with Lattice by associating the VPCs with the Lattice service network. You get the automated VPC connectivity. And when traffic just flows from instance A, it just resolves to the DNS entry for Lattice, and then Lattice forwards the traffic directly to where the services are. So it's a very simple way to understand how across VPCs, Lattice allows you simplified connectivity regardless of your compute type.
Excellent. So I'm going to pop up a couple more questions we're getting from the field. They say they would like to see a case study on reworking an F5 transit gateway EKS setup using this new service. So maybe that's something. I don't know if you have that in your back pocket or if we can get a case study on that out.
I don't in my back pocket, unfortunately, but I think the idea probably makes sense. Let me talk about it a little bit high level. It might be something that we can work together with folks on. I'd love to see this stuff come to fruition. If you think about it, in those different situations, a lot of customers do have these kind of centralized ingress models. It's very popular. It's really difficult though today. And it comes back to that kind of separation of duties, right? You got the admins that want to lock things down. No, I'm not making fun of them. That's my style. That's the hat I wear. But then you got the developers that are somewhere totally different. And what happens is you've got like these layers of VPCs hooked up with transit gateways, hooked up through multiple load balancers, both third-party vendors like let's say F5 or Palo Alto or who's another one? All the different flavors. And they also have our load balancers in front. So it's like this sandwich of things that can just be really, really tough. And it might work, and it does work, but it can be really expensive and it can be really tough to troubleshoot. And I think a lot of people don't think about that until it is that 2 a.m. call. And you're just like, wow, what am I looking at here, right? And I think automation's actually kind of done a disservice here. It's because a lot of the time, the automation makes it really easy, again, until it breaks. And then it's this chain of events you got to go back to. And so by kind of smushing this stuff in so that it's providing a lot of those layers into one solution, it helps simplify the architecture tremendously. And that was a real goal for us. And so I think we've built in the primitives that allow these other vendors to kind of bring their solutions to us, and they can empower us as a primitive. So you can get the user experience that you're familiar with, that you appreciate, that you might be running in different environments, whether it's a different cloud, whether it's on-prem, whatever, right? You can get that user experience, but then still get the benefit of that simpler architecture behind the scenes. So happy to kind of engage anybody and talk through these kind of things. I know we've got a lot of customers asking us for all kinds of sorts of different partners. And I want to make sure that we're empowering as many as we can.
Cool.
How do customers get started?
Good question. We are GA now. It was today. It was this morning. We had a couple cups of coffee, woke up early, and we pressed the button. Just kidding. All of our engineers are probably watching this going, it wasn't just a button. But no, so it's in the console now. It's in the VPC console, right on the homepage. Scroll all the way down. You'll see VPC Lattice, a couple of the new components that are there. The documentation can be found just, if you just search VPC Lattice docs or user guide, you'll find it right there. But it's if you can't find it, navigate to the VPC portion, and then you'll be able to find it there. I would say that's a good place to start. The other thing that might be helpful for folks if they're still kind of wrapping their head around some of the new components, first off, don't be scared. We're introducing quite a bit. And so this is a new construct that doesn't really have a direct parallel that exists today. This is something that is new. And so you might find our reInvent talk at reInvent helpful. And if you, again, just search VPC Lattice in YouTube or the platform of your choice, you'll be able to find it there. And I think that those are kind of good places to start. Satish, is there other places there are things that you would say?
And we're going to have workshops available too. So we'll publish those really workshops as well for you to get a hands-on experience, both guided and your self-guided workshops.
Excellent. Look, Garuna's got a question. They said VPC Lattice is great. I was thinking of running one service for all VPC environments, but will I be able to manage the same service across different regions? And if I do that?
Yeah, it's a good, first off, the first part of that question is a very typical use case. It's kind of that kind of, I want to split things up, give people sandboxes, put a service in there, and that's just how I'm going to share things amongst each other. Today, VPC Lattice is a regional service. And so it would really be solving your kind of east-west communication within the region. We are going to be working on some architectures and white papers to show you kind of how you would do this across region, but we don't have native support for multi-region today. And so we haven't talked about this too much, but we've got this idea of a service network and service. These are two components in VPC Lattice. And what he's referring to is, could I probably attach a service from a different region to my local one? You can't do that today, but there is some design patterns that still get you what you want. And so stay tuned. We'll be posting some white papers and architectures and blogs over the next couple of weeks that'll address some of those things.
Yeah, I saw that Deborah also posted the product page here in the chat. If you're on LinkedIn, it's /VPC/Lattice. And if you go to that page, we see the very simple navigation. It's how to get started, find out how it works, and then also connect with an expert. Does that mean that if somebody connects with the expert, it's one of you? Who do they expect?
It's not me. Don't send them to me, man.
It's going to redirect to Jasmine.
There you go.
And I'm going to forward it right to Justin.
And that's how old networking troubleshooting was. We just went all over the place.
So here's another question coming in. How verbose will error logging be with VPC Lattice?
I think it'll probably get you what you want. If you're familiar with kind of like an application load balancer today, the AWS Elastic Load Balancer, a lot of those same properties and kind of error responses and all those kind of things are all there. And so we've got metrics and logs, and they're in the user guide right at the very back of it, I think. They will outline kind of all the ones that are available today.
Cool. Perfect. And I think that's what's important to keep in mind, that this is an application layer, right? So it's not supposed to be like a Wireshark trace trying to troubleshoot network traffic. This is a little bit higher level. So
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if you, don't forget, a lot of people that I talk to, it's really funny. A lot of people don't realize that we actually have traffic mirroring as part of EC2. Right? This is a service that came out several years ago. And it was because everybody used to say, especially network people like myself, they would say, hey, where is span port or mirror port? I want to get my PCAP Wireshark captures. And we used to just tell customers, just run run Wireshark on your instance. And they were like, no, I don't want to do that. And so we came up with traffic mirroring that you can enable at E&I level and capture all the traffic. And so that stuff's all the same. If you want to capture any kind of traffic going in there or any of that kind of stuff, you can definitely do that.
Yeah. So we're getting close to being at time, but I want to give you guys just a couple of moments. Is there anything we left out? Is there any last minute point you want to make?
I'll let you go first, Satish.
Yeah.
I myself some time. Throw you under the bus.
Last minute parting thoughts. Just think of this as simplifying your application networks in a very simple sentence, right? And as you test the service, you'll discover a lot of the things that you are struggling with today, whether it's security, authentication, authorization, etc. So think of this as your application networking, whatever compute type you have, it's simplifying your experience for you.
That's fantastic. Well, Satish, Justin, really appreciate you both being here and giving us a glimpse into the release. Excited that you got this out. I hopefully you guys are going to leave here and go to some party and celebrate all the hard work you and your team have put in to get this out the door.
Will.
Yeah. Yes. Appreciate it, guys. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for hosting us. This was super fun.
Thanks for having us on.
Thanks. Bye.
And Jasmine, we've got the Paris Summit coming up next week.
We do, live in Paris.
Are you going?
I'm not. I wish I were.
I know. I wish I were too. There's a lucky group of hosts that I think are going to be in Paris broadcasting live all next week from the Paris Summit, which is going to be super cool, man. I can't wait to see what they're going to bring us.
Oh, yeah. It's always fun and exciting.
Well, it's been a pleasure hosting with you, Jasmine. It's great catching up and really appreciate everybody else for tuning in. This has been AWS On Air. We'll see you next week.
Bye.